Hello, and welcome to the pre-show talk for Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, a new musical at the Lead Center for Performing Arts. Now, to my knowledge, this is the first pre-recorded asynchronous pre-show talk that has happened at the Lead Center. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I think that's the case. So wherever or whenever you're watching this video, thanks for joining me, and I hope you enjoy or enjoyed the show. My name is Shawn Carlson, and I am a longtime Lincoln resident. I lived in small town Nebraska for 3 years a couple years ago, but I'm glad to be back in Lincoln, born and raised here. Have been an educator in Lincoln since the year 2000 with a little 3-year break from 2017 to 2020, but I'm now back in Lincoln Public Schools as a leader in special education at an elementary school, something I'm really passionate about and love doing. I'm also a local actor in community theater, have a little bit of experience. I left the classroom for a couple years and was a professional actor in regional theaters all over the country for a couple years back in the 2006 to 8 area. But really love theater and kind of remain involved in theater as the president of the board of directors for Pinewood Performing Arts, which is the organization that puts on the summer musical out in Pioneers Park at Pinewood Bowl. This is a shot from our photo booth set up for the Addams Family last summer. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this coming summer, 2022, Pinewood Performing Arts will be putting up Newsies, Disney's Newsies, the musical, hopefully a show that you're familiar with from the film. And I hope that you'll come out and join us this summer. But let's get back to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, a long-standing and beloved story that we've probably all got some level of familiarity with, whether it's through the book or the movies that have come out subsequent to the book. It's a story that we're all fairly familiar with, a beloved story with beloved characters. But as I started Googling around to try to find some interesting things that I could share with you about the show or about this story, I also found some takes on some interesting pathology in the characters of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, particularly Mr. Wonka, but also just the story in general. Please know my tongue is securely in my cheek as I present this take on this story and these characters as folks who may be suffering from some psychological pathology. I just thought it was interesting. It's also a nice way to kind of learn about the character traits of the characters in the story and the story itself and the changes and adaptations that have gone along through it over the years. So there's Mr. Wonka himself saying the suspense is terrible. I hope it'll last. It's not going to last because here we are moving on. So first of all, there's a take that could be made for an identity crisis around this story. You may know that an identity crisis is questioning one's sense of self or their place in the world. And this story itself has been through a bit of an identity crisis. It was published in 1964 for the first time as Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. And then in 1971, it was adapted into a film, and the name made a change. It was no longer Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It was Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And there's a few theories out there as to why this change was made. The one that seemed the most compelling to me, as they say, follow the money, had to do with some money. The good folks at Quaker Oats were one of the supporters or producers of the film, and they were prioritizing the merchandising of candy bars along with the release of this movie, and they wanted to release a Wonka bar. It didn't make sense to them to release a Charlie bar, which is a fair way to think about it. So a Wonka bar does make a whole lot more sense, and their thinking is if we name the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, we'll have a better chance of selling these Wonka bars because the name will be right there front and center. There were also some thoughts about distancing this original 1971 film from the book, because of the way the Oompa Loompas are portrayed in the original book. And neither of the films stick to the story in the book about the Oompa Loompas being pygmy Africans, is how they're portrayed in the book. And there's some illustrations that would probably be viewed as pretty problematic in today's society, and maybe even in 1971. So that's another theory. That's part of the reason why they did the name change. And then the other one, this was during the Vietnam War, and the name Charlie developed some other connotations as part of that conflict. So it could have been that was what was behind the name change. Again, I tend to think that the marketing of the Wonka bar was at the root of it all. And that's probably the main reason why the name changed from the book in 1964 to the film in 1971. And then in 2005, again, with that identity crisis, we get back to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the original name from the book. And the 2005 film does delve a little deeper into the life of Charlie and the life of Willy Wonka, and give us some more background information about them and their family, and all that good stuff. So it's interesting kind of identity crisis with the titles of this story, how they've changed through the years. Now, there's also a take on the pathology of Mr. Willy Wonka himself. Some pretty serious looking folks wrote a pretty serious looking article saying that, making the case that Willy Wonka himself suffered from narcissistic personality disorder. Here's kind of the headline, the title of that, and that starts the case for him having a narcissistic personality in the book Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So let's take a deeper dive, shall we, into this theory. So the criteria for a narcissistic personality disorder are inflated self-image, interpersonal exploitativeness, cognitive expansiveness, and insouciant temperament. Insouciant was a new word for me. If it's a new word for you, I'll dig into the definition of it here in just a minute. And then deficient social conscience. So those are the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. And the authors of that study go through and kind of point out how Willy Wonka himself does display those traits or those criteria for a narcissistic personality. And I'm going to walk through those with you. So first, the inflated self-image. He names candy bars after himself. There's several times in the book and the movies where he claims that his products are the best and the most creative and the most interesting and the most unique. So he does have a pretty inflated self-image, naming all of his products after him, kicking everyone out and believing that he can just run the whole factory by himself. And just kind of an inflated opinion of himself as the greatest chocolatier and candy maker to ever live. That one seems kind of obvious to be the case with Mr. Wonka. He does have an inflated self-image. What about interpersonal exploitativeness? And there's lots of takes out there on were the Oompa Loompas just slaves with a different name? And that's probably a fair take. The 2005 film digs a little deeper into the arrangement between Willy Wonka and the Oompa Loompas, and he paid them in cocoa beans, or in the root product of chocolate, which is something they really enjoyed. When he enjoyed a meal with them, it was slugs and insects and things like that. And when he presented them with the cocoa beans, it was something they really enjoyed. And so that film kind of makes the case that they came to work for him, excited to earn all the cocoa beans that he would be able to pay them with. The book and the earlier film don't really dig too deeply into that, so it's pretty easy to make the conclusion that maybe even their size is the reason that he's able to keep them there working for him, and have them doing his bidding for free. So there's some interpersonal exploitativeness there. And then there's also the idea that he's bringing these children and their families in, not necessarily to raise their standard of living or to do anything for them, but as a self-serving move to make sure that he can ensure his heir is somebody that he can train and control to do the things that in the factory exactly the same way that he did, not to innovate or change things after he's gone. So kind of even exploiting the idea of bringing a child in that can be trained exactly the way that he wants them trained, so that when he's no longer there to run the chocolate factory, it gets run exactly the way that he wanted it to. So there feels like there may be a little bit of exploitation there as well. So I'd call that, yeah, that makes sense. He shows some interpersonal exploitativeness. What about cognitive expansiveness? So this is just the idea that their ideas and plans and goals are not necessarily grounded in reality. So they dream big, they set big goals, and this could be a great thing. Make big plans that aren't necessarily bound by reality. And in this GIF here, he says, you should never, never doubt what nobody is sure about. Interestingly enough, that is a quote, and there's lots of quotes in the movie, especially Willy Wonka in 1971. Lots of quotes, and I'm assuming most of them are also in the book, that are credited to Mr. Wonka or to Roald Dahl writing as Mr. Wonka, but a lot of them come from other poetry, and that was one route I thought about taking for this presentation, but went another way. But it's really interesting to read. This particular quote is from a poem by a poet named Hilaire Belloc, from a book called More Beasts for Worse Children. And it's a follow-up, Mr. Belloc's follow-up to a poem book called The Bad Child's Book of Beasts. And it's all poems about different creatures. This one's called The Microbe, and talking about something so tiny that you can't see it, but really describing its physical attributes in great detail, and ending with that we should never, never doubt what nobody is sure about. So just because you can't see it, or just because in Mr. Wonka's view it seems impossible or not very practical, doesn't mean we should be sure that it can't be done. So his cognitive expansiveness frees him from being grounded in reality. And as we walk through his chocolate factory, there are lots of things happening in there that, one might think are impossible or could never be the case. The chocolate river, for example, is a pretty amazing thing that he was able to create, maybe because he had some of that cognitive expansiveness. Up next is that insouciant temperament. And again, I had to Google that one, but it kind of says, in general, more of an apathetic temperament when things are going poorly, like in this scene on the left when Mike TV from the film is about to jump himself into the TV and be beamed into the TV set and shrunk down to a tiny size, and be very negatively affected by what he's about to do. He very nonchalantly says, "Stop, don't, come back," very calmly, not speaking as though it's an emergency. So very apathetic. And he does that, especially in the 1971 film. I notice it more when every one of those children are about to walk into danger. He does verbalize that this isn't something they should do, but his heart really isn't in it. So that insouciant temperament kind of keeps him from declaring anything too serious. But what I did read about this with relation to the narcissistic personality disorder is that it's apathetic until the narcissism itself gets pointed out or the narcissist is challenged. And so on this image from the right here, when Charlie and Grandpa are found to have been drinking the fizzy lifting drinks and having touched the ceiling, which now is going to have to be cleaned and sterilized, he kind of blows up. And I wonder if there's something to, this was kind of the last kid, like all the other kids had eliminated themselves by this point, and it seemed like his big plan to find his heir and discover a child who he could train exactly in his ways to carry on the chocolate factory exactly as he had, were sort of fading from him at this point. And that's why he got so upset, that it was starting to affect him. It wasn't that anybody else was in danger, but it's that his plan seemed to sort of be falling apart. And in that case is when he displayed some emotion, some urgency, and some feelings about what was actually going on. So that one was particularly interesting to me. And then lastly, a deficient social conscience. And I kind of mentioned before that doesn't seem like Mr. Wonka created this situation with the golden tickets as an opportunity for the poor or the downtrodden. That wasn't necessarily part of his motivation. It was mostly, again, to identify a child who would be his heir and to do things exactly as he wanted them done in the chocolate factory, even after he was gone. But as we learn more deeply in the 2005 film, but we do get a glimpse of it in the 1971 film, that Charlie Bucket lives in abject poverty, and the golden ticket and the opportunity to inherit the chocolate factory is a huge possible step up for him. And the social conscience of Charlie Bucket as a child is illustrated by the fact that Mr. Wonka wants him to come live in the chocolate factory by himself, and that his family is not invited. And Charlie, in the 2005 film, almost passes up that opportunity because he isn't willing to abandon his family in their state to come and live in the chocolate factory and live that sort of high life of the owner of a chocolate factory. So his social conscience shines through, and in the 2005 film, has an impact on Mr. Wonka and kind of helps him to change his mind. So yeah, Mr. Wonka as a narcissistic person is an interesting take. Now, these are, again, beloved characters. I hope you'll take everything that I've said here with a grain of salt. It was tongue in cheek, just kind of an interesting take on the psychological state and pathology of a well known character in children's literature. Interesting to think about, but also fun to just allow to leave your mind and enjoy the story for what it is, a fun children's story, maybe a cautionary tale about the behavior of children. Incidentally, there's another take out there that I won't go into today, but that examines the children in um, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory as the seven deadly sins. And it does include some of the adults, but it mostly revolves around the children. And if you stop and think about the seven deadly sins and the children in the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory book, and maybe including a couple of the adults, it's probably pretty easy for you to make those connections between certain characters and certain of those sins like greed and pride and those kinds of things, and sloth. So that's an interesting take too. Feel free to Google that and check that out. It's just interesting to think about. But again, a beloved character, a fun, whimsical, almost kind of a clown-like character, especially for me in Gene Wilder's portrayal of him in that first scene where he comes out acting like he's hobbling in an old man and then does that tumble into the camera and kind of assures us that everything is up in the air from here on out. We don't know for sure whether he's being honest with us and telling us the truth or faking us out a little bit. And it's an interesting and pretty well-known fact that Gene Wilder insisted on that moment being in the film because he wanted to create that mystery about Mr. Wonka and whether he's being genuine with us or not, leading us to believe what he wants us to believe, or if he's showing us his authentic self. So, anyway, with that, I hope you enjoyed that interesting little tidbit of background information about the possible pathology of Mr. Willy Wonka. And I hope you will enjoy the show. Or, like I said, if you're watching this after you've enjoyed the show, I hope you had a great evening at the theater. Thank you so much for giving me your time and attention, and have a great, great evening. Thank you.